Picture this. You're sitting in a meeting room. The lighting is, I don't know, slightly too bright. The coffee's getting cold. And someone at the front is presenting a strategy that you can see plain as day is just fundamentally flawed.
Oh, yeah, we've all been in that exact room.
Right. And you aren't just guessing here. You have the analysis. Like, you have been thinking about this specific issue for weeks. You know exactly what the problem is, and more importantly, you know exactly what the solution looks like.
The data is literally sitting right there in your hand.
Exactly. But then, the presenter pauses and asks for feedback, and you say absolutely nothing.
It is a profoundly universal experience, and it's one that usually comes with this immediate sinking sense of internal compromise.
Yeah, because you justify it to yourself in the moment. You tell yourself it's not because you lack the evidence. You tell yourself that, well, being wrong in public, or even just being the one to disrupt the flow of the room, it just has a social cost you aren't willing to pay at this exact second.
The whole room seems to be nodding along, right?
Right. The momentum is moving in one direction, and breaking that momentum just feels dangerous. So you make a deal with yourself. You say, I'll raise it afterwards. I'll catch him in the hallway, in a smaller conversation when the stakes are lower.
But I mean, let's be honest. The hallway conversation never happens.
It never happens. The decision moves forward, and the problem you saw remains baked right inside the strategy, invisible to everyone except you. We have all been there. So today's deep dive is dedicated to exploring a truly fascinating piece of writing by Maria Fuentes that completely reorients how we understand this exact scenario.
We are going to unpack why staying silent in these moments isn't just a matter of, office politics or some sudden drop in self-confidence. It is a deeply ingrained neurological response.
Yeah, and we are going to connect a 17th century astronomer's dilemma to the modern corporate boardroom to show exactly what is happening in your brain when the room goes quiet. Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand why we do this today, we actually have to rewind over 400 years.
We really do. We have to start with a man who saw something with absolute, undeniable clarity, understood exactly what it meant, and then spent more than 2 decades refusing to fully say so in public.
We are talking about Galileo Galilei.
Exactly. Born in Pisa in 1564, Galileo was, well, a man of intense observation. By 1609, he had constructed a telescope powerful enough to make observations that would quite literally shatter the human understanding of the universe.
No small feat.
No, not at all. Through this new lens, he saw the moons of Jupiter. He observed the phases of Venus. He was gathering hard, empirical evidence that supported the heliocentric model of the solar system.
Which is a theory that the sun, not the earth, was at the center of it all.
Right.
So he essentially had the 17th century equivalent of the undeniable spreadsheet in his hands.
Mm-hmm.
He had the hard data.
He had the data, and, initially he did share it. In 1610, he published these telescopic observations in a short work called Sidereus Nuncius, or the Starry Messenger.
Which is a massive deal, right?
Yeah. Oh, huge. These observations were widely read across Europe. The implications were unmistakable to anyone paying attention to the math and the astronomy. The Earth moved around the sun, but the geopolitical and religious reality of the time was far less accommodating than the mathematics.
To put it mildly.
Yeah. In 1616, the Catholic Church formally warned Galileo. The Inquisition instructed him not to hold, not to teach, and not to defend the heliocentric view.
That is just a staggering wall to run into. You literally have a device that shows you the truth of the universe, and the most powerful institution on the planet tells you to pretend you didn't see it.
And he complied publicly. Privately, he continued his work. He continued his observations, meticulously building the case for what he already knew with absolute certainty to be true. But here is the critical detail Fuentes highlights. From his first telescopic observations in 1610 to the publication of his major defense of this theory, the dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems in 1632, that is a gap of 22 years.
Wow, 22 years.
And 16 of those years followed the Church's formal prohibition.
Sitting on a world-changing truth for 22 years is a psychological burden that is, it's hard to even fathom. And when he finally breaks that silence and publishes the dialogue in 1632, he doesn't even do it directly right.
Right. He presents the heliocentric argument through a fictional debate between characters.
But even with that layer of abstraction, the book was immediately recognized for what it was.
Yeah.
A defense of heliocentrism.
Absolutely. He was summoned to Rome. He was tried by the Inquisition in 1633, found vehemently suspect of heresy, and forced to abjure.
He had to drop to his knees and formally renounce his defense of what his own eyes had seen through that telescope.
Yes, and he spent the remainder of his life under house arrest until he died in 1642. And the church only formally acknowledged it had erred in condemning him in 1992.
1992.
Yeah.
Took almost 4 centuries for the institution to admit the data was correct all along.
What's fascinating here is that Galileo did not stay silent for 22 years because he was uncertain. He didn't look through his telescope and doubt his own data. He stayed silent because the cost of speaking had been made explicitly clear. And the institution enforcing that cost was simply more powerful than his evidence.
So when you analyze the historical context, his silence wasn't a lack of courage. It was a completely rational response to a deeply irrational situation.
Precisely.
But, Galileo was facing literal house arrest, the Inquisition, the very real threat of torture. That is a massive, tangible threat to physical survival. We could all understand why he stayed quiet. But you and I aren't facing the Inquisition when we sit in a Tuesday morning status meeting.
We are definitely not.
So, if the threat of torture explains Galileo's silence, what explains ours? Fuentes introduces a modern parallel in the text to help us understand this. A commercial director named Tom.
Yeah, Tom provides a perfect window into this modern career preservation instinct. He is a commercial director at a mid-sized manufacturing company. And about 18 months prior to speaking with the author, Tom identified a massive flaw in the pricing model his business had been using for 3 years.
So, similar to Galileo, Tom had the data.
He had the data. He had modeled the alternative. He had a crystal clear view of a structural error that was costing his company margin every single quarter. Armed with this certainty, he goes into a senior leadership meeting and raises the issue.
He walks in with the equivalent of the telescope data, he points out the flaw, and the response of the room is described in the source as cool.
Ouch.
Yeah, we all know that exact feeling. The temperature of the room just drops. Because it turns out this flawed pricing model had been built by the CFO.
Who is sitting right there at the table.
Right there. So when Tom points out the flaw, the room just shifts uncomfortably. Nobody actively yells at him. Nobody calls him a liar or threatens him with corporate house arrest. But the conversation just moves on quickly. His point is left hanging in the air, completely unacknowledged.
It is the dreaded, awkward silence, a subtle but very unmistakable social reprimand.
And Tom never raised it again. He told the author that he knew he was right. The numbers were undeniable. But the room sent him a signal that first time he mentioned it, and his brain decided the price of being right was just too high. So for 18 months, Tom sat in silence, watching this flawed model continue to bleed the company's margins.
18 months of carrying knowledge with direct commercial consequences entirely suppressed, all because one room, on one day, signaled that speaking came with a social cost.
Which brings us to the core puzzle we have to solve today. Tom wasn't facing the Inquisition. So why did his brain react as if his life were in actual danger just because a room full of middle managers got a little awkward? Why does the nervous system treat a minor social faux pas like a life-or-death situation?
To understand the mechanics of that, we actually have to look at the biology of rejection.
Okay.
In 2003, a neuroscientist named Naomi Eisenberger and her colleagues at UCLA published this landmark study in the journal Science titled, "Does Rejection Hurt?" An fMRI study of social exclusion.
And they put participants into fMRI brain scanners for this, right?
They did. And for context, an fMRI doesn't just take a static picture of the brain, it measures blood flow.
Right, because when a specific region of the brain becomes active, it needs more oxygen.
Exactly. So blood flows to that area. And by tracking that blood flow, researchers can see in real time which parts of the brain are working during specific tasks.
So they can watch the brain reacting to stimuli live.
That's exactly what they did. While in the scanner, participants played a virtual game of catch with 2 other avatars on a screen. Initially, everyone is throwing the ball to each other. But halfway through, the 2 other avatars, which are actually just controlled by the computer program, they stop throwing the ball to the participant. They exclude them entirely.
A digital snub.
A very simple digital snub. But the fMRI scans revealed something profound. That social exclusion activated a specific neural region called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex.
And why is that specific region important?
Because this is the precise neural region consistently associated with the unpleasantness of physical injury.
Wait, physical injury?
Yes. If you break your arm or burn your hand on a stove, this area lights up to signal distress. If you get snubbed in a virtual game of catch or in a corporate boardroom, this exact same area lights up.
Wow.
The brain does not distinguish meaningfully between being physically injured and being socially rejected. To the nervous system, both register as a severe threat. Both activate the exact same protective survival response.
I want to translate that into an evolutionary context for a second, because it really explains the why behind this mechanism. If you think about early human history, in a hunter-gatherer tribe, your survival depended entirely on the group.
Absolutely.
If you broke your leg, you might die because you couldn't hunt. But if you were socially rejected and kicked out of the tribe, you would definitely die. You would starve or be eaten. A social snub back then was a literal death sentence.
It was a very real physical threat.
Right, so over millions of years, the brain didn't bother building a separate alarm system for social pain. It just wired social rejection directly into the physical pain circuitry. When Tom saw the room go cold, his brain wasn't processing modern corporate awkwardness. His primitive nervous system was processing an evolutionary warning. The message encoded in his body was, if you continue this behavior, the tribe will exile you and you will die.
And that is the biological reality of the cool room. It is not just a frustrating social memory. It is an active neurological threat signal.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
I hear the neuroscience and, the evolutionary logic makes total sense. But couldn't Tom's 18 months of silence just be written off as professional maturity? Isn't that just reading the room,
Yeah.
knowing how to pick your battles?
I see where you're going with this. Like, if you know the CFO is sensitive about their model, and you know the CEO relies on the CFO, maybe you just hold your tongue to keep the peace and protect your political capital. Why does this have to be framed as a biological threat response?
That is a crucial distinction to make. And you're right, there is absolutely a version of silence that is just strategic patience. It's reading the organizational politics, biding your time, and knowing when to push an agenda.
Right.
But Fuentes argues Tom was not choosing his moment. He was avoiding the pain of the threat signal. And to understand why that distinction is so vital and so dangerous, we have to look at a second study that shows how this threat signal doesn't just make us quiet, it actually distorts our reality.
Distorts our reality. How so?
This brings us to a 2005 study by Gregory Burns and his colleagues, published in Biological Psychiatry. It was called Neurobiological Correlates of Social Conformity and Independence During Mental Rotation.
Catchy title. Very. They also used fMRI scanning, but this time they gave participants a mental rotation task. They showed them two 3D shapes and asked if they were the same shape just rotated or completely different shapes. It is a spatial reasoning puzzle. But they added a twist. Before answering, the participant was shown the answers of 4 other people in the room who were, you guessed it, secretly actors working for the researchers.
Okay, so they are setting up a classic peer pressure scenario. The actors all give the blatantly wrong answer, and they want to see if the participant will conform and give the wrong answer too.
That was exactly the setup, and as expected, many participants conformed to the group's wrong answer. But the terrifying part wasn't the conformity itself, it was how they conformed. When the researchers looked at the fMRI scans of the people who caved to social pressure, the brain regions associated with conscious decision-making or social compliance weren't the ones lighting up.
Then what was?
The pressure-altered activity in the occipital and parietal cortices.
Wait, aren't those the vision centers?
Yes. The regions of the brain responsible for visual perception and spatial processing. The social pressure didn't just convince these people to lie to fit in, it literally altered how their brains perceived the physical shapes on the screen.
That is wild.
The brain prioritized social alignment so heavily that it actually short-circuited the visual processing center to make the group's wrong answer appear correct.
Let's really think about the mechanics of why the brain would do that. Cognitive dissonance, holding two conflicting realities in your head, like, I see the shape is different, but the group says it's the same. That takes a massive amount of metabolic energy. It is stressful.
Very stressful.
Evolution prioritizes efficiency. So it is literally easier and less stressful for your brain to alter your visual processing to match the tribe than it is to stand alone with the objective truth.
Exactly. It alters reality to relieve the biological stress of standing alone.
So applied to Tom, it wasn't just that he felt it was unsafe to speak up about the pricing model. Over time, that accumulated social pressure from the cool room literally made it harder for him to trust his own analysis.
He knew the numbers were right initially, but that absolute certainty he felt when he was sitting alone in his office with the spreadsheet, that certainty became harder and harder to access.
It's like Galileo.
Just like Galileo. He had the literal evidence of his own telescope, but under sustained, crushing institutional pressure, he abjured. not because the stars had changed their orbit, but because the cost of maintaining that cognitive certainty against the weight of a powerful institution eventually becomes neurologically unsustainable. The brain seeks relief.
So what does this all mean? When we look at the fallout of this phenomenon, we see a massive dual cost. First, there's the obvious commercial cost. Tom's company bled margin for 18 months. Every single quarter, money evaporated because of the CFO's flawed model, all because the leadership team didn't want to endure 5 minutes of social discomfort. But the second cost is insidious. Tom suffered this quiet internal erosion of his own professional authority. Every month he stayed silent on something he knew was a fact. The gap between what he saw and what he was willing to say widened until he started doubting his own vision. Galileo paid with his physical freedom. Tom paid with his internal standing.
The currency they paid in is different, but the biological mechanism forcing them to pay is identical. And this is exactly why the standard corporate advice we always hear regarding this issue is so deeply flawed.
You mean the classic HR advice, like just speak up, find your voice, be more assertive.
Yes. That advice is worse than useless here. It is the wrong level of intervention entirely. The author uses a brilliant analogy to explain this mismatch. Coaching someone like Tom to be more assertive when their underlying neurological threat signal is still active is the equivalent of telling someone to walk normally when they have a splinter in their foot.
The splinter analogy is really good, but I think we can take it even further to understand the biological processing required here.
Wow.
Telling Tom to just speak up is like telling someone who just sprinted a marathon to just stop breathing so heavily.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
You can't just mandate away a physiological state. When Tom's threat signal fired in that boardroom, his body released cortisol and adrenaline. That creates a physiological memory. To fix the silence, you don't need a public speaking seminar. You need to biologically metabolize that stored memory.
Which takes time and effort.
Right. It's like clearing lactic acid from your muscles after a workout. You have to actively process the stress hormone so it flushes out of the nervous system.
And metabolizing the threat is the crucial intervention. Because Tom knows how to speak. He doesn't lack confidence in his mathematical analysis. He lacks safety in his nervous system. Those are two completely different problems.
Yeah.
Until you address the neurological level where that threat signal was encoded, that specific moment the room went cold, the silence will just keep regenerating itself.
So how did Tom actually do that? Because he didn't just read a book on assertiveness and start shouting louder in the next boardroom.
No, he navigated the social safety element first. He prepared differently. Instead of walking into the big meeting and dropping the bomb again, triggering everyone's defenses, he metabolized his own anxiety about the topic. And then he addressed the right people in one-on-one context before the main meeting took place.
So he removed the threat of public embarrassment for the CFO. He built social alignment offline. So when they got into the room, the tribe was already in agreement.
Exactly. Because of that careful prep work, his proposal was finally adopted and the company's margin recovered. But the most surprising part to Tom wasn't even that he fixed the company's multi-million-dollar problem. It was his own realization of just how long he had allowed his certainty to sit in silence, all because one room had once gone quiet.
And, Galileo never got that moment of vindication in his lifetime. The institution he faced was too powerful, the threat too absolute. But the professionals in our organizations today, they aren't facing the Inquisition. They are facing a defensive executive or a leadership team that simply doesn't want to admit a multi-year strategy is flawed.
Which is a manageable social cost.
Right, but the chronic silence, however, is not a manageable cost.
Which is why the author places a very specific urgency on intervening, pointing specifically to the summer and July in particular as the optimal window to rewire these neurological patterns.
It seems a little strange to put a seasonal timestamp on a neurological issue. Why summer?
It comes down to cognitive load. Processing, or as you put it, flushing the lactic acid of these accumulated threat signals requires downtime. It requires a low-stimulus environment.
Makes sense.
July is typically when the corporate diary thins out. The frantic pace slows down, people go on vacation, and the long evenings create a kind of mental spaciousness that the rest of the year simply does not afford us. The nervous system finally has the bandwidth to run those necessary background processes.
It's like restarting a computer that has been running hot for 9 months.
Yeah,
You need the system to cool down before you can install the patch.
that's a perfect way to look at it.
And the source warns that September is always right around the corner. It arrives faster than anyone expects. If you don't utilize the low-stimulus environment of the summer to metabolize these threat signals, September is going to arrive. and you will walk into the exact same meeting rooms, running the exact same defensive patterns you carried into the summer.
The author even points to specific structured resources for this, mentioning a 10-day rewire experience and a summer reset, and these aren't about learning to articulate better. They are structured biological practices designed to help you mentally rehearse those difficult moments, allowing your nervous system to slowly decouple the boardroom disagreement from the primitive survival threat.
It's about pulling the splinter out of the foot so you can finally walk into the room normally. So bringing all of this together, we so often stay silent in our professional lives because we want to avoid the immediate visceral cost of being wrong in public.
The embarrassment, the hit to our ego, the subtle social exclusion.
But this deep dive reveals that the cost of staying silent when you are actually right carries a far heavier burden. It fundamentally damages your organization by letting bad strategies run unchecked. But more importantly, on a neurological level, it quietly erodes your own connection to reality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces a complete reevaluation of every quiet meeting and every suppressed idea. It demands that we ask whether we are making sound professional judgments or merely obeying a nervous system that has been terrified into submission by social pressure.
Which leaves us with one final lingering thought for you to take away today. It builds directly on that terrifying neuroscience study by Gregory Burns, where social pressure literally altered how people saw physical shapes.
Yeah.
If prolonged social pressure doesn't just silence you, if it actually rewires the cortices in your brain to change how you perceive physical reality to avoid the stress of standing alone, you have to ask yourself a very difficult question. What undeniable facts in your own life have you slowly stopped believing simply because your professional circle went quiet when you brought them up? Take a hard look at the things you used to know for certain. Have you simply lost your voice, or are you actually losing your sight?